Hi everyone, this is Utsab. I'm going to talk about how to talk about your portfolio during a job interview. And yeah, a little bit about myself. I'm a Dev Bootcamp grad. I've also been a software developer for many years, and I've been pretty successful with job interviews. So I thought I would share some of those, some of my insights on that in this video here. So yeah, I hope you enjoy. Let me share my screen here. And let's see how do I do this? Yeah, here it is. Okay. Cool. All right, so I'd say there are two skills that you want to have to pass uh, a tech job interview uh, to become a software developer. You definitely want to know your algorithms, but I'm not going to talk about that in this video. Um, I would recommend you go to Interview Cake. Parker, he gave a couple of talks at during Career Week. I think he's pretty solid. I would go there for that. I'm going to focus on your portfolio and how to talk about that. And I'll give some examples about projects that I've done, and I'll even kind of role play exactly what I would say during a job interview. So first, what are some common lead-in questions that you might get asked, which kind of give you an opportunity to talk about your portfolio? They might ask you, what's the most challenging thing you've worked on? Or they might just straight up ask you about some project from your resume, and they'll often phrase it as something challenging, like, oh, what was really challenging about that project? And then finally, a more subtle one is they might ask you what you liked or didn't like about some language or framework that you mentioned in your resume. And again, that's an opportunity to connect it back to a portfolio project. All right, so what are some of the principles here that you want to aim for? So first, the purpose of this, of talking about your portfolio, is to communicate your process. It's not really to convey how awesome your solution is. It's more about walking them through the process you use to get to that solution. So part of communication is using visual diagrams, and that's, you might think, oh, well, that's part of communication, right? And that's true, but I'm giving it its own bullet point because there's something special about visual diagrams, especially with tech people. They really love their visual diagrams. Like I can tell you from like at the companies that I worked at, the engineers that were really respected were the ones who could break down any kind of complex topic with a nice, clean visual diagram. So the meat of whatever story you're going to tell about your portfolio project is going to center on some kind of challenge that you solved. So yeah, like everything's going to be kind of leading up to that. This is more of a nice to have, being able to talk about alternatives. If you used a framework, did you consider other frameworks? What were the trade-offs between different solutions you thought of? And yeah, that's more of like what they would expect from a senior developer, but it's nice to, it's impressive if you can talk about that. All right, so let's get into some examples here. Okay, so I'm going to talk about, let me delete that. I'm going to talk about two projects that I worked on related to Dev Bootcamp. Restaurant Roulette was my final project. And then Power Saver was something I worked on at a hackathon with some Dev Bootcamp grads. All right, now I'll just role play this out as if I'm at an interview. What would I say? How would I talk about restaurant roulette? And I'm gonna time myself on this to make sure I'm not super verbose. So let me just put it back on me. Okay, so imagine I'm at an interview and they ask me, "Hey, Utsab, what's the most challenging thing you've ever worked on?" Now, I would say, well, there was this project that I worked on called Restaurant Roulette. And the most challenging thing about this was getting the user experience to be seamless. So, okay, the kind of the problem we were trying to solve was when you're making a decision on where to eat with your friends. Everybody might have a different decision. Somebody wants Chinese food, somebody wants Indian food, somebody's a vegetarian. How do you kind of find the best option? So we basically wrote this algorithm to take everyone's preferences and then search through Yelp for something that matched, and then just send that as the final decision to everyone's phones. But the hard part wasn't really getting the algorithm right. The most interesting part, at least, was kind of getting the user interface to be as seamless as possible. So we wanted the experience, especially for the friends, to be easy. So that meant no login or registration process, because filling out a form on your mobile device is kind of a nightmare. And we're trying to make the decision process easier, right? So we don't want people to feel like, oh, this is kind of frustrating. And we actually went through several iterations of that. But anyway, can I just like draw out the architecture of how this worked on the whiteboard there, and then I can kind of explain where the challenges were. So imagine there's like a whiteboard, and I actually have some whiteboarding software, so I'll switch over to that. And switching screens, present. Okay, so I'm going to open up an app called a whiteboard app. And let's see how I'm doing on time here. Okay, about two minutes in here. Okay, so we used a Rails backend, and I'm just gonna kind of explicitly draw the interaction with the database, because this is where our challenge was, how to do our database schema and represent all the relationships between our different our different tables. And kind of at the view level, we're trying to support two different views: our desktop computer and then our mobile device. So, and then at the controller level, we were interacting with a couple of APIs. There was Yelp to search through restaurant results, and then there was Twilio to manage that communication between the user and the friends, and how do you send all these text messages back and forth. This is our high-level architecture of all the moving pieces. So let me walk you through a use case here, just to illustrate where the challenge is. So let's imagine you have an owner. He's the organizer. Let's call him the owner. He logs into the website. So first step, he has to log in and register. Unfortunately, well, we couldn't get around that. The owner does have to log in. And he'll enter his friends' info, with their names and phone numbers and stuff. And that gets stored in the database. I'm just going to write everything we store. I'll be coming back to that later, because this is kind of, there's some of the things we had to think about. So friends info. So that says owner. This says friends info. All right. So now, okay, the owner makes this new event, invites the friends, and now the friends. I'll draw them over here. Let's say this is the friend. He has his iPhone. So he'll get a text message from Twilio, and it'll say something like, oh, click here to submit your preferences. So he'll click there. He'll be taken to a website, with some forms. And we made sure these were all like drop down. He shouldn't have to enter any text, because entering text on mobile is not a very good experience. And then he'll submit that, and this will get posted back to our server, and that gets stored in our database. So preferences. And keep in mind, this is kind of what made it challenging, was the friends are not the only ones submitting preferences. The owner also submits his own preferences. So the owner also submits his preferences, and they all get stored in the database. So now the challenge that we were trying to figure out was, how can we make the friends experience super easy so that they don't have to log in or register? So let me kind of walk you through how we thought about that. Let me get some more, open up another whiteboard here. And let's do a time check. Okay, 7 minutes in now. All right. So, our first iteration, and this is where I think our one of our biggest mistakes was, we tried to go for gold in our first iteration, and we wanted to have this great user experience where people don't have to log in, and it was just too complex for us to grasp at that moment. But anyway, this is kind of what we had in our first draft. So we had this was not invitation. I think we called it invitees, or well, I'll call it invited. So the invited people, and then you have your owner who started the event, and so you have an events table, and then you have a preferences table. So let's say in this use case, the owner created an event and invited 3 people. So now, what are the relationships here? So the one that was causing us the most trouble was the relationship between owners and preferences and invited people and preferences, because they can both have preferences. So the way that's typically solved in Rails is, you have this polymorphic association, which we called participants, and an invited person is a participant, and an owner is a participant, and participants can have many preferences. And then finally, you have event can have many preferences. And yeah, so I mean, this kind of makes sense at the database level, but where we kind of got messed up was at the controller level. It was just really hard to write our first draft, like our MVP, with so many different rules, where some users, invited people, did not have to log in, and then the owner did have to log in, but they could both have preferences. It was just too much to think about and too much to manage for our first MVP. So in the end, we scrapped this, and we kind of reduced the size of our MVP. We reduced the scope of it. We simplified it. So let me open up another whiteboard to demonstrate what our second version looked like. So in our second version, we didn't worry about the clean user experience. We just said, screw it. Everybody has to log in and register. Even the friends, even the participants, they all have to register. Now, the trade-off there was, okay, it's a bad user experience, but the benefit was it was so much simpler for our database schema, and it was easier to kind of reason about the code and get something built. So, for example, we now, instead of an owners table, we just had a users table. So even the invited people had to register and they became users. We still had our events table. We had our preferences table. And I think we still had an invited table, you know, with our 3 invitees. And now this relationship was a lot easier to think about. Users had preferences. We didn't need that intermediate polymorphic table anymore. And then same relationships there. And yes, invited people had a relationship with events. Okay, so this worked, and we got an MVP built, and it was great. But after it was built, we thought, well, you know, maybe it would be nice to revisit this challenge of making the user experience better, because now, you know, it was clunky. People had to log in on their mobile device and type in text. So we wanted to see, you know, if there's a way we could eliminate that. So we revisited that challenge, and we'll open up another whiteboard to show our final thing here. Let's do a time check. 12 minutes. Wow. Okay. So we basically went back to our first draft, but changed the relationships. So we had invited, we had owners, we had an events, and we had preferences. So very similar to our first draft, right? This is our first draft. Three invited people. But we realized, you know, we don't need to keep track of whose preferences belong to which people. This was our big aha moment. All the stuff we did here, participants and all that, we didn't actually need any of that. We realized it wasn't important to remember who had what preference. In the end, our algorithm just kind of throws all the preferences into one, you know, like black box, and then it just spits out a solution. It doesn't matter which preference came from who. So we didn't worry about having a polymorphic table or anything like that. We just had 3 relationships, I believe. There was events can have many preferences. Owners can have many events, and events have many invited people. It's 3 relationships. So this worked. Now people did not have to log in. No login required. And they could still have preferences. We just didn't keep track of who did what preference. So there were trade-offs for this. Now, if we're not kind of authenticating who's filling out what preference, you kind of have a security problem there, because now it's possible for, say, somebody to hack the phone and fill out multiple preferences, and we're not tracking, who made what preference. So theoretically that could happen, but we reason that it's just the likelihood of somebody doing that and the motivation for that is so weird. I mean, you're using it with your friends. Who is really going to log in and try to break your app, right? So we figured, okay, we're sacrificing on some security there, but we're gaining this awesome user experience where people don't have to log in and they can still have a meaningful interaction with the app. So we went with that. So one thing I learned from all this is just how important it is to select your MVP wisely. There's an art to that, because you want to kind of reduce the scope of your kind of project to the point where you can do it, and then you iterate on it to your final solution, and you'll have insights along the way. So like we gained a lot of insights from our first two iterations, which allowed us to build the final thing. So it was kind of a mistake in retrospect to try to go for the final thing on iteration 1. This was a disaster. So yeah, putting a lot of thought into how you make your MVP. All right. Okay, so that's how I would conclude. All right, well, that was a lot. Let's see how long that took. 17 minutes. Wow. So I would practice that, rehearse it, try to get it down to like, 10, 12 minutes. But there was a lot of content there, and I'll try to break down what I did. So sharing my screen one more time. Let me. Okay. So what was the structure behind this? Remember, I first stated the problem. What's restaurant roulette? What were we trying to solve? And then I hinted at the challenge. Said, yeah, the main thing was trying to get the user experience seamless. And then I drew the architecture. And if you notice, I just volunteered to go to the nearest whiteboard and draw it out. And yeah, so practice drawing out your visual architecture ahead of time. And then after I drew out the whole architecture, I talked about the challenges. And here's where I kind of talked about the iterations. Like, we tried this, we tried that, dot, dot, dot. And then finally, I talked about some of the trade-offs. And then this is a nice to have, but it's kind of cool if you can mention something you learned. Like, how did this whole experience make you a better programmer? Okay, so that was all one example. I'll give one more example for Power Saver, and I'm just giving this other example here because it's very different. It's a very different type of walkthrough, and the challenge is very different. It's not so much a technical challenge. It's more about, deciding what language how did I decide what language to use? So okay, so yeah, this next one is going to be Power Saver. Let me just drink some water here. Okay. All right, so following the structure, talk about the problem. So this is a problem that I actually learned about this from a researcher at UC Irvine. Her name is Joy Pixley, and she studies a problem of people's desktop power usage, and she found that the interface is very confusing. People don't really know how much, like what their sleep settings are. Um, a lot of the times people think their computer's asleep, but it's actually not, just because the monitor is turned off. So it, it was interesting. I was going to a hackathon and I met her at this conference. So I just kind of asked her if she would collaborate with me on this and we could kind of build a better user interface together. And we did. So this was Power Saver. It's a native Mac OS X app, and it's built in Objective C. And so the challenge here was kind of figuring out whether to do it in Objective C or doing it in Swift. And I kind of vacillated. I went with Swift first, and then I switched to Objective C, and I'll kind of explain why. So, okay, and then so that was, I kind of hinted at the challenge. Now I'm going to talk about architecture. So I'll say, hey, let me draw out the architecture for this app so you can kind of see where the challenges were. So now I go to a whiteboard. So I'll switch to my whiteboard. Okay. I could let me demo the app really quick. So I have it Xcode. So this is our new and improved user interface. There's just one bar here, and for demonstration purposes, you can put it to 3 seconds, and the computer should go to sleep, which it did. And yeah, that's basically, oh shit, it's going to sleep again. Okay, let me take it off that. So now, how did we build this thing? Let's talk about the architecture now. So let me clear this. Okay, so the major challenge here technically is how do we change the computer sleep settings from within an OS X app? So it turns out that OS X exposes this command line tool called PM set. And you can literally go type this into a command into your terminal, and it'll actually change your computer sleep settings. You can do that via command line. But then the challenge is, how do you do it within a Mac app? So one way of thinking about it is, okay, you have your kind of let's call this our Objective-C kind of realm of possibilities here. And on the one hand, we wrote our interface in Objective-C. You know, that's fine. You know, you have your interface. It has some buttons down here. And then you somehow have this idea of this PM set command, and how is this interface going to actually interact with this PM set command? So that's where there's a Objective-C construct called NSTask, and that kind of acts as a wrapper around PM set. So now you have all the pieces. This can communicate with this NSTask command, and vice versa. So seems simple, but there's one key challenge here, which is when you type this in at command line, it's going to ask you for your password, and it has to be run as sudo. So you need root level privileges to run that command. Now, you can't really do that in Objective-C. Like the user can't just type in their password into your program. That would not be acceptable. So now there's this whole other kind of framework called smJobLess, which is like you're basically going to the guts of your operating system at that point. And there are tutorials out there which explain how to do this, but it's basically like, a couple days worth of reading. Okay, so now how does this kind of come back to choosing a language, Objective-C or Swift? So I initially went with Swift because, well, I had never built a Mac OS X app before, and here I was at this hackathon, and I had 24 hours to build one. And I was just Googling around for what tutorials existed, and all the new ones were in Swift. So I just went with it. And it was fine. So it was fine to a point, but then at the point where I got to smJobLess and this NSTask stuff, this is a really niche kind of topic. There aren't too many blogs out there which really talk about this. I found like one, and they had one tutorial, and it was dense. Now, because it's so niche, it hasn't been updated in a long time, so it was written in Objective-C. Now, I had just spent the last 8 hours learning Swift, and I didn't want to suddenly switch to Objective-C. Let me just put the video on me, actually, because I'm not gonna. Why does that keep happening? Where's my Google Hangout? There it is. Okay, so I had just spent the last 8 hours learning Swift. I didn't want to go learn Objective-C, so I thought, let me convert their tutorial from Objective-C into Swift. And I didn't know either language well enough to do that. So in the end, I just decided I'm going to redo the whole thing in Objective-C. And but then the trade-off for that was there weren't any recent tutorials on how to make a Mac app in Objective-C. They were all in Swift. So I had to convert, I kind of had to translate those into Objective-C. So then this is where the trade-off was happening. I could either convert a Mac OS X tutorial from Swift into Objective-C, or I could convert this smJobLess tutorial from Objective-C into Swift. I went with the former, converting the tutorial, just a generic, how do you make a Mac app tutorial from Swift into Objective-C, because I figured, well, it's kind of easier to grasp. So I went with that. But either way, I had to do some kind of conversion work. So that's why I ended up going with Objective-C. And yeah, what I learned from that was to kind of like before looking at a project, figure out what's the most challenging thing technically and look at the resources that are available. How much like community support is there? How many tutorials are written for that thing you're trying to do? And if I had done that in retrospect, I would have looked at NSTask and smJobLess, and I would have seen like it's a very niche topic. There are very, very few tutorials written for that, and they're all written in Objective-C. So, go with that. Um, so yeah, that's what I learned, to look at the developer kind of support around the hardest piece of your project. Okay, so that's that. That's the second example. And let's see. Let me go to my conclusion here. Okay, well, one thing I'll point out. Yeah, let me just switch to my thing again. Uh, well, okay. Well, I'll just say it here. This is kind of the how and the content of, the structure of what you might want to talk about. Um, Something about the delivery, I guess, that's a little bit more subtle is you just want to convey that you really enjoy the challenge. So like the feel you want to have is like when you're confronted with this challenge, it's almost like ooh, yeah, like I just can't wait to tackle this. And as you're talking about it, you want to still convey that, like, man, like I still want to work on this, and I still have so many ideas of what I would have done better. Uh, that's the kind of feeling you want to convey into your delivery. Okay, so all right. So to conclude, kind of like the major habits that you want to instill uh, just into your daily life is to always be working on some kind of a passion project. And it should be something that you're genuinely passionate about. I found if it's not something you're really interested in, you're not going to be willing to, like, you'll just give up too easily. So like, um, when you encounter that SM jobless tutorial and you have to switch languages in the middle of the night, if you're not like really interested in the topic, you'll probably just like say like screw it, or I'll do it tomorrow or something and never get to it. So always be working on a passion project. You should be to the point where if any employer runs into you at any time and they ask you, hey, so what have you been working on? What have you been doing since like Dev Bootcamp? What have you been doing in the last month? You should have an answer. You should be able to say, oh, I've been working on so and so passion project. Um, and that's where you'll be able to have like really cool stories to tell about challenges you ran into, um, you know, during your, like, while you're talking about your portfolio. Okay, so that's all. That's all I have to say about interviewing. And yeah, I hope you guys learned something from that. Thanks.